Reading from The Manufacture of Madness by Thomas S. Satz, published 1970. This is the first chapter, starting on page 8 and moving forward. We're going to call this Chapter 1, Part 2. From the beginning of its labors, the Inquisition recognized the problem of correctly identifying witches. The inquisitors and secular authorities were accordingly provided with criteria of witchcraft and with specific guidelines for their work. The vast medieval literature on witchcraft is concerned primarily with one or both of these subjects. Among these works, the Malleus Maleficarum is recognized as the most important. Sprenger and Kramer, the Dominican inquisitors who wrote the Malleus, began by asserting that, quote, the belief that there are such beings as witches is so essential a part of Catholic faith that obstinately to maintain the opposite opinion manifestly savors of heresy, unquote. In other words, Satan and his witches are as much a part of the Christian religion as God and his saints. A true believer can no more entertain doubt about the former than about the latter. To question the existence of witches is thus itself a sign of being a heretic. Which? More precise criteria of witchcraft were soon forthcoming. We were told that, for example, quote, those who try to induce others to perform evil wonders are called witches, and because infidelity in a person who has been baptized is technically called heresy, therefore such persons are plainly heretics, unquote. The authors of the Malleus further narrow the range of suspects when they observe that it is women who are chiefly addicted to the evil superstitions. Among women, they assert, midwives surpass all others in wickedness. The reason why witches are usually women is that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. And the reason why men are protected from this heinous crime is that Jesus was a man. Quote, blessed be the highest, who has so far preserved the male sex from so great a crime. For since he was willing to be born and suffer for us, therefore he has granted to men this privilege, unquote. In short, the Malleus is, among other things, a kind of religious scientific theory of male superiority, justifying, even demanding, the persecution of women as members of an inferior, sinful, and dangerous class of individuals. And having thus defined witchcraft, the authors of the Malleus offer specific criteria for identifying witches. Several of these pertain to the characteristics of diseases. They hold, for example, that the sudden dramatic onset of illness, or what looks like illness, is a typical sign that the disease is caused by witchcraft. Evil may come so suddenly upon a man that it can only be ascribed to witchcraft, they say, as they cite case histories to substantiate this contention. Here is one. Quote, a certain well-born citizen of Spires had a wife who was of such an obstinate disposition that though he tried to please her in every way, yet she refused in nearly every way to comply with his wishes, and was always plaguing him with abusive taunts. It happened that, on going into his house one day, and his wife railing against him as usual with opprobrious words, he wished to go out of the house to escape from quarreling. But she quickly ran before him and locked the door by which he wished to go out, and loudly swore that unless he beat her there was no honesty or faithfulness in him. At these heavy words he stretched out his hand, not intending to hurt her, and struck her lightly with his open palm on the buttock, whereupon he suddenly fell to the ground and lost all his sense, and lay in bed for many weeks, afflicted with the most grievous illness. Now it is obvious that this was not a natural illness, but was caused by some witchcraft of the woman. And very many similar cases have happened and been made known to many, unquote. Next, Sprenger and Kramer recommend physicians as expert diagnosticians and as expert witnesses in witch trials upon whose professional judgment inquisitors and laymen are asked to rely in distinguishing diseases due to natural causes and those due from witchcraft. And it is asked how it is possible to distinguish whether an illness is caused by witchcraft or by some natural defect. We answer that it is first by means of the judgment of doctors. For example, doctors may perceive from the circumstances such as the patient's age, healthy complexion, and the reaction of his eyes, that his disease does not result from any defect of the blood or the stomach or any infirmity, and they therefore judge that it is not due to any natural defect but to some extrinsic cause. And since that extrinsic cause cannot be any poisonous infection, which would have accompanied been accompanied by ill humors in the blood and stomach, they have sufficient reason to judge that it is due to witchcraft. That coming from Sprenger and Kramer. And back to Szasz. A third method of distinguishing natural illness from illness caused by witchcraft consisted of interpreting the form assumed by molten lead poured into water. Quote, there are some, say the authors of the Malleus, quote, who can distinguish such illnesses by means of a certain practice, which is as follows. They hold molten lead over the sick man and pour it into a bowl of water. And if the lead condenses into some image, they judge that the sickness is due to witchcraft. Unquote. In the days of the witch hunts, physicians and priests were thus much concerned with the problem of the differential diagnosis between natural illness and demonic illness. This distinction seems simple to us only because we disbelieve in supernatural illness, but to our forebears who believed in it, making this differentiation was a difficult task. Moreover, the doctors and inquisitors engaged in ferreting out witches carried out their work against the backdrop of a closely related problem that was very real indeed. They had to distinguish between persons allegedly guilty of injurious acts, especially poisoners or veneficae, and those innocent of any wrongdoing, that is, ordinary persons. By being considered simultaneously a malefactor, as bewitched, like the poisoner, and a victim, as a mere instrument of demonic powers, like ordinary all-suffering mankind, the witch helped to obliterate the sharp distinction between poisoner and non-poisoner, guilty and innocent person. Significantly, the word witch comes from a Hebrew word that had been rendered venefica in Latin and witch in English. Its original meaning was a poisoner, dabbler in magical spells, or fortune teller. The concept of witch combines occult powers with possibilities of benefaction or malefaction. In Renaissance Europe, poisoning mainly by means of arsenical compounds was a common practice. Making and selling poisons became a large and profitable trade, often engaged in by women. Quote, so rooted had slow poisoning become in France between the years 1670 and 1680, remarks Mackay, that Madame de Savaigne, in one of her letters, expresses the fear that Frenchman and poisoner would become synonymous terms. Unquote. The problem of the correct diagnosis of witchcraft must be viewed against this background. Johann Weyer, 1515 to 1588, physician to Duke William of Cleves, was one of the few medical men of his age to speak out against the witch hunts. Like his contemporaries, Weyer believed in witchcraft and witches. He differed from them only in holding that witch hunters made the diagnosis of witchcraft too often and too readily. He especially attacked the, quote, uninformed and unskilled physicians who relegate all of the incurable diseases, or all of the diseases, the remedy for which they overlook, to witchcraft, unquote, and concluded that, quote, they, the physicians themselves, are thus the real malefactors, unquote. In short, he did not oppose the witch hunts themselves, but only their abuses or excesses. Significantly, the full title of Weyer's classic work is, when translated, On the Trickery of Demons and Prayers of Poisoners. Beginning with the title and throughout the book, Weyer distinguishes between witches and poisoners. He acknowledges that there are evil people who use a variety of poisons to harm and kill their enemies. They are criminals and should be punished. However, the majority of people accused of witchcraft are not of this type. Innocent of any wrongdoing, they are unfortunate, miserable, and perhaps deluded individuals. In a letter to his patron, Duke William, explaining the aims of his book and dedicating it to him, Weyer writes that his final object in this work is legal, quote, and that I speak of punishment in another than the accustomed way of sorcerers and witches, unquote. And he concludes the letter with an uncompromising rejection of the inquisitorial process and a plea for respect for established judicial procedures. Quote, to you, Prince, he writes, I dedicate the fruit of my thought. You do not, like others, impose heavy penalties on perplexed, poor old women. You demand evidence, and only if they have actually given poison, bringing about the death of men or animals, do you allow the law to take its course. Unquote. Weyer thus insists that from a legal point of view, it is necessary to distinguish between two classes of persons, poisoners or persons guilty of criminal acts, and non-poisoners or persons innocent of criminal acts. But this is precisely the point on which his opponents assail him. Because the witches are criminals, they maintain, there is no distinction to be made. Contemporary authorities are quite clear on this. Jean Baudin, 1530 to 1596, a French jurist, leading defender of the Inquisition, and one of Weyer's most impassioned critics, asserts that Weyer is, quote, wrong, A witch and a poisoner are the one and the same thing. Everything imputed to witches is true, unquote. Another critic of Ware's, a Marburg physician named Scribonius, writing in 1588, objects specifically to Ware's attempt to prove, quote, that witches only imagine their crimes, but in reality they have done nothing untoward, unquote. To Scribonius, this means that, quote, Ware does nothing more than to remove guilt from the shoulders of the witches to free them from the need of any punishment. Yes, I shall say it openly. With Baudin, I believe that Ware has consecrated himself to the witches, that he is their comrade and their companion in crime, and that he himself is a wizard and mixer of poisons who has taken upon himself the defense of other wizards and poison makers, unquote. Mystification of the concept of witchcraft and its amalgamation with that of poisoning were useful for the Inquisition. Hence, inquisitors opposed attempts to undo this process and punished as enemies of the established theological order those who persisted in such efforts. Whereas critics, as we just saw, objected precisely to his attempts to demystify the harmfulness of alleged witches. Doing so was, as the Malleus had clearly laid down, a grave and sinful error. Quote, and yet there are some who, rashly opposing themselves to all authority, publicly proclaim that witches do not exist, or at any rate that they can in no way afflict or hurt mankind. Wherefore, strictly speaking, those who are convicted of such evil doctrine may be excommunicated, since they are openly and unmistakably to be convicted of false doctrine, unquote. Because it is essential for a clear grasp of our subsequent discussion of witchcraft and its parallels with mental illness, I have tried to show in some detail that the emphasis of Ware's argument is not where modern psychopathologists claim it is, that is, on a criticism of the concept of witchcraft and a plea for its replacement by that of mental illness. Instead, it is on the procedures employed by the inquisitors. These methods will be surveyed in the next chapter. With the decline of the power of the Church and of the religious worldview in the 17th century, the inquisitor-witch complex disappeared, and in its place arose the alienist madman complex.